It all started in the early days of our marriage when Angela and I were still learning how to live together under one roof. We were young, two people trying to balance love with the daily challenges life kept throwing our way. Back then, the small victories were everything: buying our first house, raising two high-energy boys, and settling into a quiet, suburban life. It was simple, and for a while it was enough. But as time passed, the picture-perfect life we had worked so hard to create began to show cracks. Angela had always been the adventurous one, constantly looking for new experiences. I, on the other hand, found comfort in stability and routine. Over the years, those differences became more pronounced, slowly widening the gap between us. I poured myself into work and the responsibilities of raising our kids, while Angela seemed to yearn for something beyond the walls of the life we had built together. Then came that quiet Sunday, a day that would mark the beginning of everything unraveling. I wasn't in the mood for church, so instead I wandered into a hardware store. I wasn't shopping for anything in particular, it just felt better than killing the day playing golf like I usually did. As I roamed through the aisles of tools and home supplies, I crossed paths with Owen Crofton. We weren't exactly friends, but we'd had a few conversations over coffee in the past. Just casual acquaintances, really. As fate would have it, both of our wives, Angela and his wife Ella, were set to leave the next morning for a week-long Caribbean cruise. Angela had told me the trip would be easier and more affordable with just the two of them sharing a cabin. She also said I'd be a third wheel and insisted I stay home to take care of the boys. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I didn't see the point in arguing. "Hey, you heading out on that cruise tomorrow too?" Owen asked as we stood near the pest control section. "Not me," I replied, shaking my head. "Angela said you couldn't get time off, so I'm staying back with the kids." Owen gave me a puzzled look. "What?" "I work for my uncle. I can take time off whenever I want." I was ready to go. "Ella told me you couldn't make it?" An uncomfortable silence settled between us. I could feel the weight of something unspoken hanging in the air. Before either of us could say more, an older man in a motorized cart rolled up and grumbled for us to move out of his way, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was in that moment I felt a shift. Something deep inside me stirred with unease. I glanced at Owen, and a weight began to settle in my stomach, a feeling I couldn't shake. "Feel like grabbing a coffee?" I asked, hoping to clear my head. "Yeah, let's do that," Owen replied with a shrug. 2 hours later, we found ourselves in a corner booth at McDonald's, sipping coffee and splitting a couple of apple pies. It didn't take long for us to piece things together. Our wives had planned this cruise, and it didn't seem like it was just a casual girls' trip. There was something more to it, and we both knew it. The question we didn't want to ask lingered in the air until I finally broke the silence. "So, Owen, do you think they're meeting guys on this cruise? Or is there already someone in the picture?" Owen rubbed his face, visibly uneasy. "Want another pie?" he asked, stalling. But after a moment he exhaled and added, "I don't think Ella's out there looking for random guys. If anything, this feels planned." I nodded, the sinking feeling in my gut worsening. "Yeah, you're right. If they were just looking for something random, they wouldn't need to go through all this trouble. They could find that around here." We sat there quietly, staring out the window, watching cars move through the parking lot. The atmosphere felt heavy. Finally, Owen broke the silence. "They both work at Tri-Point Casualty Insurance. If it's someone, it's probably someone from work," he said, his voice low but serious. His words hit me like a splash of cold water. I leaned back, trying to process it. If they're bold enough to go on an entire cruise with them, then this didn't just start last week, I muttered bitterly. "You think they've already crossed the line?" Owen asked, his gaze fixed on the table. I didn't respond, but the silence between us spoke louder than words. We both knew the truth. Owen let out a sharp breath, stood up, and returned with a glass of ice water. He poured some into our steaming coffee and stirred slowly, deep in thought. "Ella's been working late a lot recently," he finally admitted. "Nights, weekends too. I didn't think much of it until now, but it's hard to ignore." "Same with Angela," I confessed, swallowing the bitterness in my throat. "But I'm not just going to sit here while she's out there living it up." "Agreed," Owen said with a firm nod, his expression hardening with resolve. We decided to meet again at the same McDonald's the next morning after the women left for the airport. Before we parted ways, I turned to Owen and said, "Keep quiet. Don't say anything to Ella. If they know we're on to them, it's over." "Got it," Owen replied, giving me a thumbs up as we went our separate ways. When I got back home, everything seemed normal on the surface. Reed, who was 7, and Jalen, now 10, were glued to the TV as usual. I had spent years trying to convince them to play outside more, but I had finally surrendered that battle. In the kitchen, Angela was bustling around, making a late lunch with her usual energy. Yet, something was off. Despite leaving for a week-long trip the next day, she didn't mention the cruise. Not a single word. It struck me as odd, suspicious even. I sat down at the table, pretending everything was fine. But in the back of my mind, all I could hear was the conversation Owen and I had just had. Something wasn't right, and I was determined to find out the truth. I took the boys outside to kick a soccer ball around while Angela was busy inside, meticulously packing for her trip. She seemed entirely absorbed, double-checking her bags like she was preparing for a major event. Meanwhile, I played goalie for Reed and Jalen, but my attention kept drifting back to the house. How had I missed the signs for so long? How had I been so blind? "Hey, Reed, Jalen," I called out, trying to sound cheerful. "You guys are staying at Grandma and Grandpa Farmer's next week while I get some painting done in the house." They didn't argue or complain, didn't even hesitate. Within 10 minutes, they had thrown together their bags and were waiting eagerly by the front door. A week at my parents' farm, with horses to ride and wide-open fields to explore, was an easy sell. When I told Angela, she grumbled under her breath, but surprisingly, she didn't put up much of a fight. That night, Angela announced she was going to bed early to get some rest before her early flight. I saw my opportunity. While she was in the shower, I made a decision I wasn't proud of. I rummaged through her suitcase. My instincts screamed that something was off and I had to know. And I found it. Her sleepwear wasn't the usual kind you'd pack for a girl's trip. It was much more suggestive. In her makeup bag I found a brand new orange bikini. But the worst discovery was buried at the bottom of her suitcase, a box of 20 condoms. I stared at it in stunned silence, my mind racing with anger and disbelief. My chest felt tight, my head pounding as I tried to comprehend what this meant. There was no innocent explanation for this. Later, I sat in the living room, mindlessly staring at the TV long after Angela had gone to bed. She had promised to call me every day during the trip since her job provided international phone coverage, but after what I'd found, I wasn't exactly feeling confident in her promises. Trust? That was gone. The next morning, I drove her to the airport. Ella was already there, waving and smiling like this was just another cheerful vacation. Angela walked over and hugged her without a second thought, barely acknowledging me as she hurried off with her friend. I stood there watching, trying to mask the swirling storm of emotions inside me. As planned, I met Owen afterward in the McDonald's parking lot. He was waiting with 2 coffees, his expression grim. "Tell me you didn't find anything," he said, his voice tense. I shook my head slowly, the words bitter in my mouth. "She packed lingerie, a bikini, and condoms?" Owen's jaw tightened, his grip on the coffee cup visibly straining. "Ella had 2 new dresses and, yeah, same thing. Condoms." "Unbelievable," I muttered, shaking my head in disgust. Neither of us spoke for a while, the weight of the situation pressing down like a lead blanket. We both knew what was happening now. There was no room for denial anymore. I shook my head in disbelief. "If I hadn't thought to check her makeup bag, I wouldn't have found them," I muttered. We sat quietly for a while, letting the gravity of it all sink in. Neither of us wanted to admit what those discoveries meant, but the evidence spoke for itself. Finally, we decided we couldn't sit idle any longer. It was time to act. Our first stop was Tri-Point Casualty Insurance, the company where Angela and Ella worked. We asked to speak with Glenn Ward, the head of HR. Glenn had gone to high school with us. He wasn't a friend, exactly, but he was familiar enough that we felt comfortable approaching him. When Glenn arrived, his expression was one of weary curiosity, probably sensing this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. After a brief exchange of greetings, we got straight to the point. Owen and I explained our concerns and Glenn sighed heavily. He didn't seem all that surprised, which only fueled my frustration. He typed a few commands into his computer, and within moments the printer hummed to life, spitting out 2 sheets of paper. Glenn handed the documents to us, his eyes watching intently as we scanned the pages. My eyes locked onto a name almost instantly, Clayton Marlowe. Right below that, another name jumped out, Calvin Salisbury. My heart sank. I nudged Owen, who leaned over to read. "These 2, I said quietly, my voice tight with anger. "They're on the same cruise as Angela and Ella." Owen let out a slow breath, his jaw clenching. "We don't need to see the rest," I added, folding the paper in half. "That tells us everything we need to know." Owen straightened in his chair and spoke firmly. "Here's the deal, we're filing a lawsuit. You can choose how you want to handle it, through our attorney or your legal department. Your choice." Glenn ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. His gaze darted between the 2 of us as he tried to come off as apologetic. "Look, I'm really sorry about all of this," he stammered. "Nobody filed a formal complaint, and since everything seemed consensual, we didn't intervene. We knew something was going on, but without any reports, our hands were tied." "Well," I said, standing up and leveling a hard stare at him, "you've got one now. Fire all 4 of them and this ends quietly. If not..." Glenn knew exactly what I was implying. He nodded, clearly shaken, as we left his office. Back in the car, I rubbed the back of my neck, exhaustion and frustration washing over me. "The only reason I'd even think twice about all this is for the kids," I muttered. "I can't lose them, Owen. I just can't." Owen's voice was low, filled with empathy. "I get it, man. If I couldn't see my girls, it'd destroy me. But it's like the system is rigged against us. Ella cheats, and I'm still the one who's going to pay the price. It's a trap," I said bitterly. "Stay and you deal with the lies and betrayal. Leave and you lose everything that matters. Who the hell came up with these rules?" Owen sighed heavily and kicked at a patch of gravel near the parking lot, his frustration mirroring mine. The next step in our plan took us to Nancy, one of Angela and Ella's junior colleagues. Nancy worked in a small corner office with her agents, but the moment she saw us walk in, she visibly tensed, like she already knew why we were there. Her team exchanged nervous glances before hurriedly grabbing their things and leaving for an extended lunch break, their half-eaten brown bag lunches abandoned on their desks. Owen and I sat across from Nancy, who was trying, and failing, to maintain a calm demeanor. Her fake smile barely lasted a few seconds before her fingers began nervously tapping on her desk. Finally she spoke. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Owen and I exchanged a glance. The tension in the room was so thick it might have suffocated anyone who lingered too long. And then, without warning, we both burst out laughing. It was a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the office like a thunderclap. Nancy's smile vanished instantly. She pressed her lips together in a thin, defiant line, clearly realizing we weren't there for pleasantries. "Don't play games, Nancy," I said, my voice cold. "We know exactly who's on that cruise with our wives." Her jaw tightened, but she remained silent, her eyes betraying a mixture of fear and defiance. Whatever loyalty or fear was holding her tongue, Owen and I were determined to break through it. We weren't leaving without answers. "I can't tell you that," Nancy said firmly, her voice trembling just a bit. Owen leaned in slightly, his tone calm but laced with tension. "All right," he said, "then just answer this. What room are Angela and Ella staying in?" Nancy fidgeted nervously in her chair before finally blurting out, "Room 117 on the sunset deck." I shook my head, leaning forward and tapping the desk hard enough to make her pen wobble. "That's not the answer I asked for, Nancy. You know exactly what I mean." Her face twisted in frustration, and for a moment, it seemed like she was weighing her options. I lowered my voice, cold and firm. "If you even think about tipping them off, you'll have much bigger problems than us showing up here again." She flinched slightly and knew I wasn't bluffing. Owen crossed his arms and sighed heavily. "So what now?" "I don't know," I admitted quietly. "But this feels like something we have to see through." We decided to take action. Owen arranged for his 2 daughters, Melanie and Miriam, to stay with his sister Beth for a few days. Beth already had 2 teenage girls, so taking care of them wouldn't be much of a stretch. Meanwhile, I set things in motion on my end. We had to be discreet but efficient. The cruise ship offered free Wi-Fi, which gave us a plan. Owen would bring his laptop and gather as much information as possible. Contacts, emails, phone numbers, addresses. We weren't sure how we'd deal with their phones yet, but that was a challenge for later. According to the ship's schedule, it would dock in Montego Bay on Wednesday morning. We found a sightseeing flight that would get us there by 7 a.m. It was inexpensive, and within an hour, our reservations were confirmed. By Tuesday night, we packed only the essentials. No need to overthink it. Owen's laptop was ready, and we kept things simple. As the first light of dawn spilled across the market stalls of Montego Bay, we stood waiting near the docks, watching the passengers disembark. Everything was so organized, like a perfectly rehearsed routine. Tour buses lined the streets, ready to whisk tourists away on their excursions, while others headed into town for shopping and sightseeing. Then we saw them. Angela and Ella walked off the ship, their faces lit with wide, carefree smiles. It was like they didn't have a worry in the world. But it wasn't just the 2 of them. Behind them, holding their hands, were Clayton Marlowe and Calvin Salisbury. Seeing them together hit harder than any conversation or discovery could have. There it was, confirmation in plain sight. No more doubts. Angela's bright, radiant expression was the complete opposite of the version of her I'd seen at home. It was like I didn't even know the woman standing before me. Owen cursed softly under his breath. I didn't say anything. We just stood there taking it all in, knowing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. I didn't need any more convincing after seeing Angela and Ella with their companions. We refocused, turning our attention back to the ship. At the check-in desk, another $100 secured us spots under the names Bob Jones and James Moore. Just like that, we were officially passengers. We didn't bother settling into our cabin. Instead, we grabbed some quick sandwiches and spent the next 2 hours exploring the ship. Every stairwell, elevator, and passageway was carefully noted in our mental map. We avoided the main dining room and showroom since those were obvious places Angela and Ella were likely to be. We couldn't risk a premature confrontation. Back in our cabin, Owen set up his laptop to monitor the ship's Wi-Fi and download as much data as possible. He was still shaking his head, unable to believe how brazen Angela and Ella had been earlier. They let themselves be seen in public like that? He muttered incredulously. I couldn't shake off the sight either. We'd watched as they strutted around the port with no sense of guilt or fear, acting as if this trip was just an ordinary getaway. Later, we hired a local to discreetly tail them and their companions during their day in town. Another $200, $100 for the collector plus a tip for the driver, secured us all the intel we needed. Worth every penny, I muttered under my breath as we waited for Angela, Ella, and their men to head back to the ship. Once they were out of sight, we returned to our cabin to strategize further. From the balcony, we had a clear view of the entrance to the main dining hall. Couples were starting to line up for dinner, dressed to the nines. I had no doubt Angela and Ella would show up early to hit the dance floor later. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later there they were. Owen leaned forward, smirking as he watched them. Look at them, he said, shaking his head. They're trying so hard to act normal. Ella pulled Angela aside and whispered something urgently. Both women scanned the room with sharp, panicked movements, clearly feeling like something was off. I raised my glass toward them in a mock toast and muttered, "Welcome to the show, ladies. Welcome to the show." Nancy's earlier warning echoed in my mind, be careful who arrange their rooms. It gnawed at me as I observed Ella nervously pulling out her phone and rapidly typing a message. I imagined she was trying to reassure herself that everything was still under control, unaware that we were already several steps ahead. Later, back in the cabin, Owen sifted through pictures he had managed to retrieve from the cloud. Some of them seemed innocent enough, Angela and Ella sightseeing with Clayton and Calvin, but others were far more intimate. Hand-holding, cuddling, even kissing. One of the images featured Angela in the bright orange bikini I'd found in her suitcase, her laughter frozen in the frame after a wardrobe mishap left her giggling. Every image I saw tightened the knot of fury and betrayal in my stomach. It was undeniable now. They hadn't just crossed a line, they'd obliterated it. Angela adjusted her bikini awkwardly in one of the photos, but the still images were already damning. A video would have been better, sure, but we had plenty to work with. Owen spent the next hour crafting a collage, carefully selecting about a dozen of the clearest and most incriminating shots. The final page featured all four of them, Angela, Ella, Clayton, and Calvin, caught in various affectionate poses, rum drinks in hand. Once the collage was complete, we took a breather and headed to the pool deck. From our spot, we could see the pool filling up with passengers laying out towels, laughing and splashing in the water. Angela and Ella appeared not long after, settling into two poolside chairs. Strangely, there was no sign of Clayton or Calvin. Where do you think they went? Owen muttered, scanning the deck. Don't know. Don't care, I replied, sipping my drink. But let's have some fun. At the far end of the deck, a teenage boy sat engrossed in his phone, texting furiously. I nudged Owen and nodded toward him. After a brief discussion, we approached the kid, offering him some cash in exchange for a simple task. Make a quick call to Angela, using an unfamiliar number. The boy eagerly agreed. I dialed Angela's number and after a few rings she answered. Hello? Her voice was tense, like she was already on edge. It's me, I said in a low voice. We know everything. You're not safe here. A pause, then a sharp intake of breath. Who is this? She demanded, panic creeping into her voice. I ended the call without answering, handing the phone back to the teen as I stifled a grin. Owen and I burst into laughter, wiping tears from our eyes. I handed the kid another $20, saying, keep quiet. Don't mention this to anyone. This is awesome, the kid whispered excitedly, tucking the cash into his pocket before scurrying off. We stood back and watched as the tension on the pool deck escalated. Angela yanked a towel over her head, trying to hide her face while both women scanned the deck nervously. Their agitation was almost comical. "She's probably calling her mom or one of her sisters," I said, shaking my head. "Doesn't matter," Owen replied. "Everyone she calls has already seen it." We spent the rest of the afternoon relaxing, keeping an eye on the situation as it developed. When dinner time rolled around, Clayton and Calvin resurfaced in the dining room, sitting at a table for four with two empty seats. Angela and Ella, however, were nowhere to be found. The two men didn't seem to care. They spent the evening drinking at the cabaret bar on the lagoon deck. Later that night, we followed them discreetly to the dining room. They were seated again at the same table, talking quietly over drinks. Owen and I exchanged a quick glance and came to a silent agreement. Without hesitation, we strode over, pulled out the two empty chairs, and sat down as if we'd been invited. Calvin glanced up, his face betraying mild surprise before he gave a slow, measured nod. Clayton, on the other hand, tensed immediately, his expression darkening as he recognized who we were. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said with a polite smile, leaning back in my chair. "Mind if we join you?" "I assume you know who we are," I said calmly, watching Calvin's measured nod and Clayton's increasingly tense posture. "We know who you are," Clayton muttered, his eyes narrowing. He didn't like this situation one bit, and it showed in the way his jaw clenched. The tension at the table was palpable, but Owen leaned back, still smirking as if he had all the time in the world. We let the silence hang for a few moments before engaging in some idle conversation, ordering drinks and taking in the ocean view. The sunset bathed the horizon in warm hues of amber and gold, casting a surreal glow over the water. It was almost peaceful, except for the storm brewing right beneath the surface. "That was bold," Owen said quietly later as we stood on the upper deck. His smirk hadn't faded. "Not sure what your goal was back there, but you definitely got their attention." "Honestly? I'm not sure either," I admitted, taking a slow sip of beer. "Let's regroup tomorrow and figure out where to go from here." As it turned out, tomorrow came sooner than expected. "Gentlemen, I'm Mr. Sensen. May I have a moment of your time?" The voice was deep and authoritative, commanding instant attention. We turned to find a towering man in a sharply tailored suit standing before us. Behind him, two attendants stood with their arms folded, like statues silently guarding their leader. "Sure, Mr. Sensen," I replied cautiously. He gestured for us to follow him to a quieter corner of the ship. His attendants stayed behind, observing but keeping their distance. When we were alone, Mr. Sensen spoke again, his tone low but firm. "Did you threaten Mr. Salisbury and Mr. Marlowe?" Owen and I exchanged a quick glance, silently agreeing on our approach. There was no point in denial. "Yes," I admitted without hesitation. Mr. Sensen raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Care to explain why?" I leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. "I think you already know. In fact, I'd bet you played a part in it." He tilted his head thoughtfully as though weighing my words. "Go on." "Nordic Cruise Lines arranged for Mr. Salisbury and Mr. Marlowe to share accommodations on this ship with our wives, Angela and Ella. We know about the arrangements and we know what's been going on," I said firmly. There was a flicker of recognition in Sensen's expression, but he didn't confirm or deny anything. Instead, he responded coolly, "Mr. Farmer, Mr. Cunnings? I need your word that you'll refrain from any further contact with Mr. Salisbury and Mr. Marlowe for the rest of this cruise. Can you promise me that?" I smiled broadly, though it was more for show than sincerity. "Absolutely. You have our word." Sensen studied us for another moment, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to escalate the situation. He finally signaled to his attendants and the trio walked away, their footsteps echoing faintly on the deck. Owen and I remained silent for a few moments, savoring the small victory. It wasn't a total win, but it was enough to keep things moving in our favor. "Let's send a few more emails tonight," Owen suggested, grinning mischievously. "Good idea," I agreed. The night wasn't over and there were still moves to be made. Later that evening we got to work drafting emails, carefully ensuring they'd have maximum impact when delivered at just the right time. This was far from over, and every step we took brought us closer to turning the tide. I leaned against the railing of the balcony, my chest tightening as my dad's words sunk in. "Did she say where she was going?" I asked, gripping the phone like it was a lifeline. "Not exactly," he replied, his tone steady but laced with concern. "But I did hear her say something to Jalen about Noble's Grove. It seemed to cheer him up. You know how much he loves that place." Noble's Grove. Of course. It was a lakeside cabin community where Angela's family often gathered. A part of me had already known the answer before I asked the question. "Are her siblings or cousins there?" I asked quietly, piecing it all together. Yeah, Dad confirmed. A few ants too. You know how they are. They always circle the wagons when something goes wrong. I sighed, frustration mounting. It didn't surprise me. Her side of the family had probably branded me the villain by now. They think we're despicable, I muttered bitterly, half to myself. They always do, Owen chimed in later when I told him about it. He gave a dry chuckle. But you know what? I don't care. We didn't send that email for them. He was right. We hadn't sent the emails to prove anything to Angela's family. The people we had sent it to, our friends, colleagues, and old college buddies, definitely got the message. The replies had been priceless. Memes, gifs, and laughing emojis flooded our inboxes. It felt good knowing that the people who mattered most had our backs. Angela and Ella, however, hadn't responded. Not a single word. Owen and I spent that evening quietly in the ship's Leo lounge, nursing our third beers of the night. The atmosphere was oddly peaceful, the kind of peace you feel after dropping a grenade and walking away from the explosion. We ate slowly, savoring what felt like one last calm moment before reality came crashing back down. When we finished, Owen turned his phone back on. It buzzed almost immediately with missed calls and notifications. He frowned, scrolling through the list. "Missed call from my brother," he muttered. "Yours ringing yet?" I shook my head, though deep down I was bracing for what was to come. Later, as we sat on the flight back, the weight of everything hit us harder than ever. The ship swayed gently in the distance, but we were already far from it, drained emotionally and financially. The bold plans we had started with, thinking we could control the outcome, now seemed almost laughable. The truth was sinking in. Control was an illusion. We had set events in motion, but where they'd land was still a mystery. Owen stared out the window, lost in thought. He had his daughters, even if Ella was gone. They were still his anchor. But me? I had no idea what awaited me on the other side of this. The thought gnawed at me as the plane cut through the dark sky. I had no wife, no kids, nothing waiting for me at home. When I walked through the door, the silence hit me like a punch to the gut. No boys arguing over the TV remote, no laughter or footsteps echoing through the house. Just emptiness. I needed answers, and the first place I turned to was Samantha, Angela's childhood friend who sometimes stayed at our place. She met me with a stiff expression when I asked about Angela. "She stayed here for one night," Samantha said flatly. "Then she left. Didn't say where she was going." "You sure about that?" I pressed. I could tell from her body language that there was more she wasn't saying. "I'm sure, Arthur," she said firmly. "I'd tell you if I knew more." I studied her face, hoping for a crack in her resolve, but there was none. Pushing her further wouldn't get me anywhere, so I let it drop. 6 weeks later, I stopped by the boys' old school to check on their records. The woman at the front desk greeted me with a bright smile as she pulled up the information on her computer. "Oh yes," she said cheerfully. "Their records were transferred 2 weeks ago." "Transferred?" I repeated, a sinking feeling in my chest. "Where to?" She gave me the name of the new school, a small private academy in a town nearly 2 hours away. It was the kind of school Angela's family loved, and I knew immediately where they had gone. My stomach tightened in frustration. How could she afford that on her own? Later that week, Angela and I finally sat down to talk. She was defensive at first, but I was done playing games. She tried to throw out excuses, how expensive everything was, how she couldn't make ends meet. "I can't afford rent, utilities, food." "Not with the boys in school," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll pay for it," I interrupted coldly. "I'll cover rent, utilities, groceries, school costs, and clothing for the boys. But you, Angela, are a grown woman. I'm done carrying you. Get a job that fits their school schedule or work evenings. You'll figure it out." Her eyes widened slightly, searching my face for a way to argue. But I didn't budge. I held her gaze until she finally sighed and nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "For the boys?" I stood, placing my empty coffee cup on the table. "Good." When I got home later that day, Reed and Jalen were waiting for me. I noticed something was off immediately. Reed was unusually quiet, and Jalen's eyes wouldn't meet mine. "What's going on?" I asked, bracing myself. Jalen hesitated before speaking. We saw something. In Mom's bedroom." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "She was in there with a man," Jalen added softly, his voice shaking. "Who?" I demanded, though I already had a horrible feeling about the answer. "Clayton," he whispered, the name hitting me like a hammer. "They didn't have clothes on." I felt like I couldn't breathe. I didn't need to ask for more details, but Jalen pulled out his phone and handed it to me. There were photos, blurry but damning. It only took one glance to confirm everything I feared. Mom said if we told you, we'd have to move back to Frackville, Reed added in a quiet, defeated voice. That's not happening, I muttered, already planning my next move. I wasn't going to let Angela or anyone else manipulate my boys like that. I stood up, my mind racing. Pack your things, I told them. We're leaving.